and welcome to the Education and Focus series by Network of Education Policy Centers. In this session, we will focus on the regional edition of the Global Education Monitoring Report that was published earlier this year on inclusion and education. And this year, one of the regional focuses was on the region that the network covers, so it was very interesting for us as well. NEPC was one of the partners that was responsible for collecting data in the 30 countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia, and also responsible for drafting 3 chapters within the report on curriculum, teaching materials, and assessment, on the COVID influence on inclusion in education, and on teachers and school staff. And this is the chapters that we will focus on today. I have a pleasure to host Tijana Jokic-Zorkic from the Center for Education Policy from Serbia, who was one of the authors and co-authors of the chapter. And her center was actually responsible for the chapters on teachers and school education. Welcome, Tijana, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Lana. Thanks for inviting us.
Okay. What we will focus on is a little bit of the recommendations that refer to that chapter and some of the findings. So let's start. One of the key recommendations was really on the teachers, and as we know, teachers are crucial in the school systems everywhere in the world, and the same for us, of course, in the region. And the recommendation says that all teachers should be prepared and supported to teach all students. However, the findings of the report confirm that actually teachers are not prepared and don't feel prepared for inclusion in its wholesome idea. Could you maybe point out to some good examples of teacher preparation for inclusion in the region?
Yes, of course. That's a very good question and important one to answer. Unfortunately, our report is not the only one that says that teachers are not well prepared. However, we identified some examples of good practice of initial teacher education, so it would be important to share such knowledges. For example, there are 2 universities in Hungary. One is Miskolc University and another university in Pech, who established close partnerships with schools, and not only between institutions like faculties and schools, but also between teachers, academy staff, faculty staff, and teachers in schools, which are valuable mentors to students, to future teachers, at both places. Students go to schools to practice in classroom to acquire the professional identities, to acquire professional practices, to develop professionally, and this process is supported both by teachers in schools and teachers at universities. So this would be an example that can be shared across the region.
Yeah, because one of the things that we find is that actually teachers don't have a lot of practice before they actually enter schools,
exactly.
And especially not practice in inclusive settings. So
exactly. And sorry for interrupting. Another, let's say, a tricky thing is that not all teachers are educated to be teachers in the first place. Subject teachers, what we call subject teachers, are initially educated to become experts in various fields. And then later on, through some courses, they acquire pedagogical skills. Lower primary school teachers, they educate differently, they get different education across the region, but subject teachers are, let's say, are not very well prepared from when they finish initial education. So this is another thing, another challenge that should be addressed in the future.
And what we also found in the report basically is that initial teacher training is not based on the inclusive paradigm, right? So they have a own subject here and there, but the idea that inclusion is like an overarching thing for teachers is not really there.
Yeah. Also, medical approach is what dominates. Initial teacher education in some countries, also in-service teacher education. While let's say holistic approach to education through inclusiveness, and inclusiveness as a cross-cutting principle is not so common in the region. During the initial teacher education, if inclusion is addressed at all, it is usually through some corrective approach, compensation approach, defectology approach, let's say, and which puts in focus students with disabilities mostly, while other types of other diversities are not so present in teacher education, are not covered by teacher education. Also, not all universities offer obligatory subjects, which are inclusion related, in the sense that where inclusion is quality education for all students. So this is really a mixture of different types of approach to inclusion, and it's not always obligatory. Yeah, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So we kind of can say that in general, and data shows that from PISA and from other bigger studies, that teachers are not really prepared during their initial education. Recommendation says that they should also be supported for inclusion. I guess we can talk about what happens once they're in schools and actually teaching. So how about supporting teachers? What do the systems offer in this respect?
Different systems offer different support to teachers. Most common are psychologists and pedagogues across the region in general, where psychologists mainly are supposed to work with students and to support students, while pedagogues are foreseen to support teachers in the teaching process and professional development as well. However, as inclusive education is slowly, or well, is becoming an orientation of education systems in the region, systems tend to offer support to teachers through other kinds of supports, like teaching assistants, or through special educators who support either students or teachers, pedagogical assistants as well, that sometimes serve as, let's say, cultural mediators between communities and schools, parents and schools. Usually in the region, this is the case with Roma pedagogical assistants, who are supporting inclusion of Roma students in Roma children in education. So different kinds of support, but unfortunately, the general impression is that this support is not enough, that it is often lacking in most countries, and unfortunately sometimes roles of supporting personnel are not well defined and are sometimes vague, or tend to become some kind of administrative support on one hand, and on the other, also the backside of the process is that usually the supporting personnel are seen to be the carriers of inclusive education. So they are seen the same as inclusive education as an extra component of education, which is devoted, let's say, to education of students with disabilities. So what we previously mentioned, were that inclusive education is not well understood as a general effort and joint endeavor. This is the case with supporting personnel as well.
So basically, the systems are turning in order to support teachers to actually employing extra staff, right? And this, as you said, are professional staff such as psychologists, pedagogues, social pedagogues, and others. And of course, it seems very unsustainable in many ways that you would have every school with all these services at once. Mm-hmm. And then we have this idea of
resource centers.
Resource centers, yes.
Yes, in some countries, there's been, well, for a while now, initiatives to establish resource centers. Usually those are the schools for educating children with disabilities, or previously called special schools, that are being transformed into support centers. Also, there are support teams or support networks that are established at local or regional levels. And the goal of establishing all of these centers or teams or supporting networks is actually support for teachers and students to participate in quality education. well, different countries found different solutions. Some countries did not embark at all, or at least yet, on this road, so on this trip. So we expect that this will become well, important resource in the future.
And like, let's say, a trend in where
Yeah.
countries are going towards. If we can go back a little bit to the teacher assistants, or not really assistants, but assistants in the system, because they're really assistants are assigned to a child in most systems. Yeah. And of course, then we have some other examples that are not from the region where we have actually teacher assistants or co-teachers in a classroom. Did we find any examples like that in the region where the systems are turning towards more of some kind of peer teaching between different professionals in one classroom?
Not exactly, unfortunately. There are assistants who are, well, let's say formally employed as teachers' assistants, but in practice the situation is different. Usually this is an assistant to children or a group of children. So this is the case. Usually, the most common is student assistants. Let's call them like that, where assistants support students in their like everyday practices, going to school, going back home, but also supporting learning. And but this usually tends to be a support to individual child out of the classroom, or at least out of the group activity. So this is currently trend, and well, we found let's say traces in country reports that this needs to change, that the traces of needs to address this challenge, and yeah, I guess that at one point we will move more towards co-teachers and real teachers assistants than today.
Yeah, another thing that I think the report points out, but also from just practice, and I'm sure you're aware of that, is that these assistants are actually don't have assigned competencies. So they're not really fully in the system, as in what is the job description of an assistant, what kind of competencies they have, what kind of education they need to have. Did we find anywhere where this is better defined?
Well, some countries tend to well, regulate the education of support personnel, and this usually requires at least a bachelor degree, but more often master's degree in educational sciences or special education, or combination of those. But I think this might be in Armenia, but I have my note here. Just let me find it, which country that is. But on the other hand, for example, in some countries, secondary education of teaching assistants is the minimum requirement. So this is also something that should be changed. Yeah, let me get back to the example of country where this is well regulated in a few minutes. I just need to scroll through my notes to find that. Maybe we can proceed to next question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the issue of assistance was let's say like an urgency measure, because really there was big issues when inclusion was introduced by law, and it was like a measure that most ministries went for because it seemed to be a quick fix, but things need to really be developed further there in both what the role of the assistant is, that sole responsibility cannot be on the assistant for the learning of the student, and I guess also the role of professional support staff in school is also something that really needs looking into still.
Yeah, exactly.
We know that school leaders, or directors, as we call them in the region, are crucial for creating inclusive school culture. The report doesn't refer too much to the school leaders, and actually, as far as I can remember, is that there is not too much on offer for the school leaders in the sense of either continuous professional development or pre-service on these topics. Do you know from other examples from your practice what happens with school leaders and inclusion?
Yeah, well, country reports did not address this question directly, but what we could notice, and what I know from my practice and from the situation in Serbia, is that there are initiatives to educate school leaders additionally in the area of inclusive education. As you mentioned, how to establish inclusive culture and how to support teachers and other employees in maintaining and developing this culture. What proved as let's say good leadership practice, good leaders practices are how can I say, establishing close and trust-based cooperation between employees, between teachers. Also, really establishing meaningful connection and relations between teachers and school policies. Maybe this is not the right expression, like close relation and meaningful relations, but what teachers in inclusive schools say about school policies and their principles is that everything they do is related to school values, which are detailed, elaborated in school policies in great detail, and the other way around, their practices feed into the school policies. And this is all guided by leaders and also psychologists and pedagogues, support personnel to teachers and to students. And in inclusive schools, division of labor looks more like a branching tree, let's say, than a strict divide between according to different expertise. In inclusive schools, teachers and principals and support personnel complement each other, and they share works, they share their work and the labor, and are acquainted with each other's assignments, and they often conduct it together. Of course, I mean, I can continue about this for a long time, but learning communities are very important, and then for inclusive culture and for teacher professional development in the area of inclusive education. So good leaders also nurture learning cultures, learning communities.
Mm-hmm. So it is really about cooperation also on all levels, and not this hierarchical leadership, which in many cases we have. Maybe just to finish off with continuous professional development, part of it is this learning community. The report does pay quite a lot of attention to this. What were some good examples of continuous professional development that the systems have adapted to?
Mm-hmm. I owe you an answer in which country education of support personnel is very well established. Georgia, it was not Armenia. I'm sorry, Georgia is the one that has a really good initiative. Yes, yeah, and that requires really high academic degrees for support personnel. The very good examples of in-service teacher professional development, as you asked, they can be described as professional development systems that are planned within the inclusive paradigm, so planned in advance and not implemented as an ad hoc solutions to emerging problems. So planning goals and developing professional education programs in line with these goals. It is usually the case that non-government organizations offer professional development programs, but if the commitment at the system level is right, then it really does not matter if courses or professional development programs are offered by NGOs or by institutes or faculties, as long as there is close cooperation between them and communication between the programs and the established goals. So that would be like a joint characteristics of good examples of in-service professional development.
Could you point out maybe to a country where this is so, or is it like happening in somewhere and not really systemic anywhere?
I would say that it's not very systemic. It is still in the, let's say, the like national projects that are currently being implemented, that are expected to outgrow the project to become sustainable and part of the system. Yes, countries that do so, I think that's Slovakia has a really good project that tends to become part of the system. So I think that would be a really good example.
Good example to look into.
Yeah.
Tiana, there is much more in the report than what we have covered today. I hope we've done a good teaser for those who will listen to us and go back to the report, which you can see at the end of this presentation, a link to get into it and read more about different policies on teachers in the countries that the report covered, but also in the global education monitoring report that covers the whole world. There's also some very inspirational, I would say, examples. But what we do know is that the education of teachers, especially pre-service, needs to be based on inclusive paradigm, and they need much more practice, and the Hungarian universities are a good example of how this can be done. Thank you, Tiana, for your time and for your inputs. Until the next Edu Focus, goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for invitation and have a good day.